Hi everybody, welcome to part 2 of the brain and cranial nerves lecture. Sorry it took me so long, I'm a busy lady. So let's pick up right where we left off. We were talking about the ventral surface of the medulla oblongata. So the ventral surface has two anterior bulges that are shaped sort of like baseball bats, and we call these the pyramids. So decussation of the pyramids is an important feature, which is why it's illustrated so prominently, and it's important because it's the location at which descending motor information crosses from the left to the right, or vice versa. So that means that the left cortex controls the right muscles, and so forth. The olives, or olivary nuclei, there are two. They are here and here. So you can think of the pyramids as being stuck onto the front of the olives. So these send input to the cerebellum, which give proprioreceptive signals, and that helps to smooth out your motion. So we ended last by talking about cerebellar hypoplasia in cats. So if you don't remember that, go to the last lecture. All right, so the dorsal surface, so we've flipped it around now, the pyramids are on the other side. The nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus have, so here's the nucleus cuneatus, and here it, and here it is on this side, and here is the fasciculus gracilis. So the fascicle is the white matter chunk, the nuclei are inside of there, and these contain sensory neurons, which relay information to the thalamus on the opposite side of the brain. So on their way up to the thalamus, they decussate to the other side. So 5 cranial nerves arise from the medulla, and those are 8 through 12. So let's count them out. Not the facial, that's number 7. 8 is the vestibulocochlear. It's neighbors with the facial nerve. 9, IX is 9, is the glossopharyngeal. 10 is the all-important vagus nerve, 11 is the accessory nerve, and 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. So let's move right along. Speaking of the hypoglossal nerve, here we have it in schematic. So here's our pons, here's our medulla oblongata, and here's our hypoglossal nerve. That is cranial nerve 12. So hypo means below. Let me get my pen. Here we go. So hypo means below or beneath, and gloss means tongue. So the hypoglossal nerve innervates, as you might expect, the bottom of the tongue. So this is involved in tongue movements. It's mixed, but it's primarily a motor nerve that controls the skeletal muscle making up your tongue. So I'm actually using my hypoglossal nerve right now to manipulate my tongue to produce speech. So damage results in an inability to protrude the tongue if both sides are damaged, or a deviation towards the injured side, and ipsilateral atrophy if one side is damaged. So what does that mean? Well, let's say I damage, let me draw myself a little head. This is going to be a really weird drawing. I'm just going to go ahead and warn you. So let's say this is the left, and this is the right. So if I ask this patient to stick out their tongue, and we know that the damage results in deviation toward the injured side and ipsilateral atrophy. What that means is the tongue is going to sort of deviate towards the left, and the left side is going to appear sort of crinkly because it's lost muscular tone, so this muscle tissue has gone away, compared to this side, which still has robust innervation and therefore muscle tissue. So you get this tongue asymmetry. The accessory nerve, note here it comes through the jugular foramen, so there's a reason we taught you all those skull foramina last term. So the accessory nerve emerges from the jugular foramen. The cranial portion of it arises from the medulla, and that innervates the skeletal muscles of the throat and soft palate. The spinal portion arises from the C-spine, so a little bit lower, and this innervates the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. So here is the SCM, and here is the branch that innervates the trapezius. So if you damage this on one side, you get impaired head, neck, and shoulder movement. So imagine if you were to cut this right here so not cutting the vagus nerve because that's dangerous, just cutting the accessory nerve, you would get cessation of motor control to the muscles on this side. And you might get deviation towards the injured side because as the muscles atrophy, they contract. All right, vagus nerve. Now, I mentioned earlier that I referred to it as being all important, and that is because if you pay attention to the stuff that it innervates, it's really important things like your heart and your lungs. So these two things are your staying alive in the short term organs. And these organs are just as important, so they are for processing waste, dealing with blood. So here's your spleen. It's not a kidney, this is a kidney. So the vagus nerve receives sensations from the viscera. So let's say you overeat and you have a tummy ache. The information that your stomach is overstretched is going to ascend on the vagus nerve. It also controls your cardiac muscle and the smooth muscle of the viscera and the secretion of digestive fluids. So in this regard, it participates with the pacemaker cells of the heart and of the enteric nervous system to help them do their jobs. It also innervates, as you can see, the larynx, which is how you produce speech. So you get hoarseness or loss of voice if one side is damaged as a result of you being unable to control the contraction of your vocal cords during speech production. You also get impaired swallowing. If both sides are cut, your heart's connection and your lungs' connection to your central nervous system are lost, and that results in immediate death. So you want to be careful with your vagus nerves. Okay, glossopharyngeal. So remember, I said that the root word gloss, here it is, gloss. Gloss means tongue, so let's write that in. And then pharyngeal refers to the pharynx. So this does what it says. It innervates the tongue and also the pharynx. So it controls swallowing, salivation, so you can see it innervates the parotid gland. Gagging, so if you stick something in the back of your pharynx and you have this reflexive closure of your pharynx to limit how deep into it a thingy can go, that's the reflex of gagging, and it's coordinated in part by the glossopharyngeal nerve. And also sensations from the posterior third of tongue. And this is actually the bitter and sour tasting region primarily. So all regions of your tongue are capable of tasting all of the flavors, but there is some localization of flavor to specific tongue areas. So bitter and sour tend to be perceived as coming from there. So damage results in loss of bitter and sour taste and impaired swallowing. Okay, the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is my favorite cranial nerve. So the vestibule, if you think of this structure I'm circling with my pointer here as being a weird snail, where here's his little shell, here's his head, and he has a bunch of really fancy antennae. The head and antennae portion is the vestibule, and that is full of hair cells and fluid that help you transduce balance. And the cochlea is the shell of the snail, and inside of your cochlea are hair cells that are concerned with hearing. So the cochlear branch begins in the medulla oblongata, and the vestibular branch begins in pons. And that's mostly because of the pons' proximity to the cerebellum, which we already know plays a role in proprioreception and balance, and because the vestibular system senses the position of your head in three-dimensional space, it makes sense that it would cooperate with and connect to the cerebellum to coordinate your movements and balance. So, if you damage the cochlear nerve only, so not the vestibular nerve, the cochlear nerve, so you cut this only, not this, you get deafness on the side of the cut nerve or tinnitus, which is ringing. The vestibular branch, if that were to be cut, you would lose your sense of balance, so you would experience vertigo. So damage to the individual branches is pretty rare because they're embedded in bone that protects them, but when they join each other, they're a little bit more vulnerable. So if you damage or squish this, you get deafness, vertigo, nausea, which is related to the vertigo, loss of balance, and nystagmus. And nystagmus is eye movements from left to right that are corresponding with a loss of visual tracking. So left and right, back and forth. Eye movement. Okay, so how might you injure your medulla? This is not a manual or a guide for medulla injury. You should not try to do that, but rather it's hard to imagine how you might hurt this given its position, so we're going to describe it so that you can avoid hurting your own medulla oblongata. So a hard blow to the back of the head is the primary way this can occur, and it may be fatal because the medulla oblongata is the site of a lot of control of very important structures, especially via the vagus nerve, which you can see here. So the cranial nerve malfunctions on the same side of the injury for those arising from the medulla. And the most dangerous among these are irregularities in breathing and heart rhythm. So those are the ones that are going to threaten your life the most if you do manage to injure your medulla. So brainstem injuries in general are to be avoided because a lot of very basic everyday operating conditions control type of activities happen in the medulla. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the pons, which is upstairs from the medulla. So there it is. And the pons, similar to the medulla, is a site of lots of central control. So control of everyday body activities that you're not necessarily aware of, but ones which are really important for survival. So let's get to it. It's a bulge in the brainstem. It is rostral to the medulla, so above and forward. It contains ascending sensory tracts, so a lot of sensory information passes through the pons on its way to synapse in the thalamus. It also contains descending motor tracts, which of course pass inferiorly to decussate in the medulla, so it's a major information highway. There are also pathways into and out of the cerebellum. And in particular, there are pneumotaxic and apneustic areas that help control breathing. So pneumotaxic refers to the detection of qualities of breath. So are there irritants? How fast are you breathing? Do you need to breathe more or less? And apneustic areas are more regulatory. So are you breathing or not? Should you start breathing? Those kinds of things. There are also nuclei concerned with sleep, hearing, balance, taste, eye movements, facial expression, facial sensation, swallowing, bladder control, and posture. So I think the take-home message here is the pons is really important. Has a big job. So, cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 arise from here. So the reason that I want to go back and address one thing. The reason that there's some overlap between where the emergence of cranial nerve 8 claims to be, because remember we saw that on the medulla as well, but now we see it again here, is because really it kind of comes off this crack between the two, so it can be attributed to both. So it's about 1 inch long. There are descending and ascending tracts, and with regard to the connections to the cerebellum, there are cerebellar peduncles, and peduncle is a science word that means connecty bit, but it's really fun to say, so peduncle. And these are sort of not easy to see in sagittal section, which is the way it's typically illustrated, but you can see them elsewhere. So an intact cerebellum and brainstem will show you robust connection between the two on the edges, so just not in the middle. And those carry sensory information to the cerebellum, primarily from, you guessed it, proprioreceptors. So let's write that in there. So there's our pons. Okay, so we've already gone over the vestibulocochlear, so let's talk about the facial nerve. So this innervates your face and your tongue. So provides facial expressions, meaning it's motor as well as sensory, so this is considered to be mixed. The sense of taste on the anterior 2/3 of your tongue, and this is the area that transduces things like saltiness, sweetness, and umami as well. You'll learn more about the umami flavor when we get to the sensory system. Also innervates a bunch of serous glands on the face. So a serous gland is any gland that produces a thin watery fluid that's rich in protein. So salivary glands, check. They produce lots of spit with enzymes. Tears, check. And the nasal and palatine glands, which moisten your nasal cavity and your palate. So damage to this produces sagging facial muscles, which we know as Bell's palsy. And a disturbed sense of taste, so you miss out on sweet and salty flavors primarily. So the branches of the facial nerve, if you reach your hand around the back of your head, are the temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, and cervical. So these are just an easy way to sort of map those nerve branches physically to the face and neck, which helps you and clinicians estimate where they are. And you can see that that bears out in this image over here. So clinical testing for these things, you can test the anterior 2/3 of the tongue with substances and ask the patient to report whether or not they can taste them. You can test the response of tear glands to ammonia fumes. So if you remember that image from lab where the person had those little ammonia-soaked pieces of paper stuck to their lower eyelids, it looks pretty painful. So if you produce tears in response to that, then your facial nerve is okay, or at least portions of the temporal and zygomatic are. And you can test motor function of faces as well. So you can ask the patient to make different facial expressions to see if they're able to. Okay, cranial nerve 6, the abducens. This is a weird one. Oops. So the abducens controls one muscle and one muscle only, and it's the lateral rectus. So it's the muscle that pulls your eye laterally to the side. So this is motor only. So if you get damage to this, the affected eye is going to rotate medially away from the muscle that's lost innervation, because now you have no muscle tone over here, but the medial rectus maintains muscle tone, so it pulls the eye towards the center of the face. The trigeminal nerve, so trigeminal means 3 twins, so it has 1, 2, 3 major branches, and they come in pairs on each side, so trigeminal. So this is the main sensory nerve to the face. So it's responsible for facial touch sensation, pain, and temperature, and also the muscles of mastication. So if you damage this on one side, you lose the ability to chew or bite down on that side, because as you can see, it innervates the temporalis, the masseter, and the buccinator and pterygoids. So damage produces loss of facial sensation in the zones affected and impaired chewing. All right, moving on to the midbrain. So the midbrain, and it's surrounded in green up here, but let's circle it down here. It's really short. So I'm going to draw a box around it. There we go. So this is only about 1 inch in length, and let's make our box better. There's a bigger one. So it's only about 1 inch in length, so I've actually drawn the box more accurately, and it extends from the pons to the diencephalon. Running through it is the cerebral aqueduct, which connects the 3rd ventricle here to the 4th ventricle down here. So if you were to take a cross-section of the midbrain, you can see the cerebral peduncles here. So these are the white matter tracts that connect the brainstem to the cerebrum. And because it arises from an embryonic structure called the mesencephalon, another name for the midbrain is mesencephalon. Cranial nerves 3 and 4 emerge from here. So here's one of those, the oculomotor nerve. And this is responsible for eye movement. So the cerebral peduncles hold the corticospinal tract. So let's break down that word. Cortical means coming from the cortex. And spinal means spine. So I'm going to go back because I don't want, whoopsie, I don't want the laser. I wanted the pen. But my stylus that I'm using is really sensitive, and if you hit the wrong thing, Microsoft Word won't let you do anything else. Okay, so that's fixed. This stands for cortex. So remember, sometimes tracts are named for their origination and their destination. So corticospinal means from cortex to spine. And you can infer from the fact that it's initiating at the cortex that this is a descending efferent tract, and it therefore must be motor. Because remember, we have our same DAVE acronym, and that says that sensory equals afferent, motor equals efferent. So the tegmentum connects to the cerebellum and helps control fine movements via the red nucleus. And the red nucleus is named the red nucleus because it is red. So that's right there. So here we have the tegmentum, and the tegmentum we'll talk a little bit more, or excuse me, the tectum, my bad. The tectum we'll talk a little bit more about. So the tectal plate consists of two bodies that control eye movement in response to visual tracking and rapid movements of the head to orient to sound. So those are next up. Other notable areas, the substantia nigra, which is here, so it's this thing and this thing. And similar to the red nucleus, it's named for the color of the tissue at the site. So normally, neural tissue is either whitish or grayish, but there are places where that is not true. So the red nucleus looks red, and the substantia nigra, that means black substance. And it's called that because there's abundant neuromelanin in here. So neuromelanin is a precursor for making dopamine. So the chemicals melanin, melatonin, and dopamine are related. They're part of the same biosynthetic pathway. So neuromelanin is melanin that's specific to the nervous system. So because a lot of dopamine is being made and processed here, one of its metabolic precursors, neuromelanin, is abundant. So this sends inhibitory signals to the basal ganglia and the thalamus. And that helps control unwanted muscle movement. So if it degenerates, you get unwanted muscle movements in the form of tremors, and the pathology is called Parkinson's disease. So today in lecture, and today I mean the day on which I'm recording this, you had a quiz question regarding what an effective treatment for Parkinson's would be. And the two that were correct were either increase dopamine, so administer dopamine or dopamine-like drugs, or administer drugs that inhibit dopamine reuptake by the dopaminergic neuron. So that increases the amount of time that dopamine spends in the synapse. So that's kind of the rationale there. And we'll go back into Parkinson's again a little bit later. Okay, so I promised a description of the tectal bodies. And the tectum consists of 4 nuclei called the corpora quadrigemina. So let me grab my pen here. So this whole thing that I'm boxing up is the corpora quadrigemina. Corpora means bodies. Corpus is singular, corpora is plural. And quadrigemina means 4 twins, and that's because the superior colliculi are bilateral. There's one on each side, so here's one superior colliculus, and here is the other one, and here is one inferior colliculus, and here is the other one. So the reason I'm emphasizing the us versus I is because many of you on the quiz in lab that concern the subject matter identified one colliculus as a colliculi, but that is a spelling error because that is plural. And I was only pointing at one because I only had half of the midbrain present. So this is the cerebral peduncle in a better view. So if we go back one, this is what the cerebral peduncle looks like in cross-section. And here is what it looks like in situ when it's actually doing its job and it hasn't been sliced up. So, back to the tectum. So the superior colliculus, each one on each side, is responsible for tracking moving objects. So if I move a pen back and forth in front of your face and I ask you to follow it, the superior colliculus is involved in this. It's also involved in reflexive looking at and attending to sudden visual stimuli. So if you see something out of the corner of your eye and your eye darts to it, that's a superior colliculus reflex. The inferior colliculus is responsible for reflexive turning of the head to sounds. So if you experience a sudden sound, say a car near you backfires unexpectedly and you find yourself involuntarily whipping your head around to look at the source of the noise, the inferior colliculus is involved in that reflex. And both of these are adaptive because they kind of force you to attend to sudden, very intense stimuli, which can give you a survival advantage. Okay, the reticular formation. And I'm actually going to show you a chunk of the reticular formation. So the reticular formation occupies this reddish blob in the medulla, pons, and midbrain, so in the brainstem. But it's tricky because once the reticular formation gets to the cortex, it's extremely diffuse. So the radiations occupy a lot of brain tissue in a sort of random, unordered fashion. So it spreads out like a fan. But while it's in the stem, it's more or less organized. So here it is in this picture. So reticular formation and reticular formation. There we go. So this is before it goes poof once it gets to the cerebrum. Okay, so the reticular formation has many, many, many functions, which you'll see over the next few slides. So we're just going to kind of do a flyover summary of what it does in general to give you an idea. And you can divide these up according to function. So one of those is the motor arm, so it regulates balance and posture. It helps participate in the circuits between the eyes and ears to the cerebellum. And as you might imagine, communication with the colliculi is involved as well. There are gaze centers in there that allow you to track moving objects, so again, overlap with the superior colliculus. Itself, it includes cardiac and vasomotor centers, so it's not only the pons and medulla that have those, so too does the reticular formation. And importantly, the reticular formation is the origin of descending analgesic pathways. So when we get to pain a little bit later in spinal pain gating, descending analgesic fibers that come down from the CNS to block pain in the PNS originate in the reticular formation. So the reticular activating system. This regulates sleep, and if you injure it, it leads to an irreversible coma, so you're not going to wake up. So the reticular activating system is responsible for a phenomenon that's familiar to most people. So remember a time when you were trying to fall asleep and maybe you were drifting off in a semi-conscious state, and then suddenly, for seemingly no reason, your whole body seizes up and jerks, and then you're awake. That seems to be the reticular activating system remembering a time in evolutionary history when humans still slept in trees. So that sleep jerk is designed to basically periodically rouse you enough so that you can reposition yourself and grab back onto the tree branch you're sleeping on so you don't fall down and become prey for a leopard or lion or whatever is waiting at the bottom of the tree to eat you up. It also is involved in waking up from sleep in emergency situations. So any stimulus that is connected to danger, so smoke, intruders, lights, These are all things that you might want to wake up for so you can protect yourself or flee, and the reticular activating system helps with that. Now, I said if you damage it, you get a coma, so what does that mean? Well, it also helps you maintain consciousness and keeps you awake. So correspondingly, it regulates sleep, and correspondingly, it's responsible for comas if you damage it too severely. Okay, so the diencephalon consists of several different parts. We're going to talk about the thalamus first, and then we're going to skip over to the cerebellum for a minute before returning to other stuff that's in the diencephalon. So the diencephalon itself consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland, as well as the epithalamus. So this is an oval mass of gray matter, and there's one on each side, so it is bilateral. And it protrudes into the lateral ventricle. So the lateral ventricle is nearby, and then the thalamus encloses the third ventricle. So down in this crack is where the third ventricle lives. Now I want to stress that the thalamus is not actually blue and green and red and yellow. These are just false colors that have been assigned to the image based on the job of the groups of neurons that live in those regions. So we'll get more into those a little bit later, not in too much detail, but in a little bit of detail. So the thalamus's primary function is to serve as a relay center. So basically what its job is to receive information coming from the periphery to the cortex. So the cortex is the final destination, and the thalamus has to sort this. So it decides where the information is coming from based on the labeled line. So labeled lines theory states that the only way your brain really knows where a sensory signal is coming from is because the wiring, so the neurons that deliver the signal, are labeled as being from the destination that they come from. So hand lines coming from the hand are labeled hand, and those are directed to the hand area of the cortex, just to give you one example. So the thalamus knows all this, and it directs everything to the appropriate spot. So it sort of functions as like a switchboard operator. And if you're too young to know what that is, I mean, those were even before my time. A switchboard operator was the person who used to connect the wires on the switchboard so that your phone line could connect with the person you were trying to reach. So you had to call them first in order to reach whomever you were trying to talk to. It's also interconnected to the limbic system. So the limbic system actually is this sort of circular ring-like structure that is bilateral, and it's on either side of the thalamus, and it has robust connectivity to the thalamus. So along with the limbic system, the thalamus is involved in emotional and memory functions. Come on, advanced slide. There we go. It's either too sensitive or not sensitive enough. Go figure. Okay, so the cerebellum itself. So here it is from the superior view, and here is the inferior view. So back here is the posterior, and this is the anterior. So there are two cerebellar hemispheres, just as there are two cerebral hemispheres, and the cerebellar hemispheres are divided from each other by the dural structure called the falx cerebelli. That's not the same thing as the tentorium cerebelli, which divides the cerebellum from the cerebrum, so it's important to keep those separate. Falxes divide left from right. Tentorium divides this thing up here from this thing down here. So there are two hemispheres, and there's a deep fissure. There is also a vermis, which is this little sort of ridge of material between the two hemispheres. So vermis means worm, and it's named that because if you look, it does very much resemble a little worm nestled right between the two halves of the cerebellum. So we discussed the cerebellum a little bit already when we talked about the wobble kitties, of course. So it corrects voluntary muscle contraction and posture based on sensory data from the body about actual movements. So an easier way to say that is it compares your intended motion, the one you mean to do, with what's actually happening. And if there's a discrepancy between the two, the cerebellum will allow you to make adjustments so that your motion is smoothed out. It also participates with your vestibular system to give you a sense of equilibrium, so you can hold a stable body position in a variety of conditions, either standing still or even while standing on something that's moving, like, for example, the deck of a boat. So the transverse fissure is the fissure between the cerebellum and the cerebrum, and that's the fissure that is normally occupied in a living person by the tentorium cerebelli. The cerebellar cortex is folded into folds, but unlike in the cerebrum, the folds of the cerebellum are called folia, not gyri. And there are also central nuclei, so like here's some gray matter that is central rather than peripheral, so that's considered to be a nucleus. Because of the way the cerebellum is shaped, the white matter that occupies the middle section, this takes the shape of a tree, and it's named that. So it's called the arbor vitae because it is tree of life, and that is the white matter. So this just shows you some more detail. So here we have the median aperture. So CSF is going to flow out through there. You can't see the lateral apertures here. Here's the fourth ventricle, so that's separating the cerebellum from the pons anteriorly. And then just above the cerebellum, we've got the midbrain with the tectum and the cerebral peduncle, and then familiar structures down here. I just mentioned the cerebral peduncle, but there are also cerebellar peduncles. So remember, a peduncle is that fun science word that just means connecty bit, so it connects one brain thing to another brain thing. So there are superior, middle, and inferior peduncles that attach the cerebellum to the brainstem. So let's point those out with my pen, shall we? So here we have the inferior peduncle of the cerebellum. Here we have the superior peduncle, and here we have the middle peduncle. And I always like to circle those. So once again, here's superior, here's inferior, and here's middle. I like to circle them because, as you may have noticed, simply drawing a line to something doesn't always really tell you the extent of the tissue or what the organ is actually shaped like. It's kind of hard to understand that sometimes, so I like to just outline things instead. It provides more information for you. So the inferior carries sensory information from the spinal cord. The middle carries sensory fibers from the cerebral cortex and basal ganglia. And the superior contains motor fibers, so sensory, motor. So inferior and middle carry sensory from different locations. Superior peduncle of the cerebellum carries motor information. So that is way too big. I made it smaller. There we go. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that the thalamus encloses the third ventricle, and really it's more correct to say the diencephalon itself encloses the third ventricle, but the thalamus is the nearest area. So this is a coronal section of a brain at about the middle. So you can see openings into the lateral ventricles here. You can see the thalamus, which partially encloses the third ventricle, which is right here. So here's the thalamus. And there are an assortment of subthalamic nuclei that all have different jobs. We're not really going to go into those too much. Down here we have the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is on both sides of the bottom of the third ventricle. And then at the very bottom we have little chunks of the optic tract. So the floor and the inferior part of the walls is the hypothalamus. The superior is the thalamus itself. So there's those two structures outlined all together. So the thalamus, I promised we would come back to it, and now we have, is a 1-inch long mass of gray matter in each half of the brain. And it's connected across the third ventricle by the intermediate mass, which is sometimes called in Latin the massa intermedia. So if you come across that on the internet, like you're using somebody else's Quizlet or something, and you see the word massa intermedia, that just means intermediate mass. They're the same thing. Okay, sorry, I'm back. I had to sneeze, and I didn't want to sneeze into the microphone. I thought that might be alarming for you, so I paused. All right, so I mentioned that the thalamus is a relay station for sensory info on the way to the cortex, and that's true, It's also minorly involved in crude perception of some sensations. So crude in this case means very rudimentary detection. So touch is happening as opposed to I am receiving a very nice hug from my friend. So detail poor is another way to say this. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that the false colors were really a way to show you different thalamic nuclei that have different jobs. So here's another way to represent this. And note that the projections from the thalamus go to a lot of different places. So it's really hard to make general statements about the functions of the thalamic nuclei because the thalamus has such a big job and it's involved in so many processes. So we're just going to sort of very briefly and generally touch on this. So we talked about the relays of auditory and visual impulses as well as taste and somatic sensations. It also receives impulses from the cerebellum and basal ganglia. That should say and, not or. I apologize for that. And the anterior nucleus, which is here illustrated in blue, has robust connection to the limbic system and is therefore involved in emotions, memory, and knowledge acquisition, which we call cognition. So the ability to learn a thing and then store the thing. All right, the hypothalamus. So here's another case where the image has been false colored. And that's because the hypothalamus has many nuclei that are robustly studied and their functions are very well known. So the hypothalamus isn't really a candy jar full of delicious little multicolored morsels. It's just a convenient way to say, hey, the medial preoptic nucleus is different from the anterior hypothalamic nucleus. This one right here, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is my favorite one. It's called that because it's above the optic chiasm, so supra meaning above, chiasmatic meaning optic chiasm. And this one, which we abbreviate the SCN, contains a tiny molecular clock. And this runs on a 24-hour period. It receives input from your optic nerve, and it's reset to correspond to dark light periods by the pineal gland, which is back here. So, SCN, super cool. If you want to learn more about it, I suggest you give it a Google. Google Scholar, though, not regular Google. So there's a dozen or so nuclei all crammed into this tiny little region. These red guys are the mammillary bodies, and these are a relay station for olfactory reflexes. And you may have noticed that in your sheep brains, the mammillary bodies were really big compared with those on the humans. So let's write that down. And that's because sheep have more robust and sensitive and detailed olfaction than humans do. Compared with other mammals, our ability to smell is pretty poor. So mammillary bodies vary in size, and that size variation reflects organismal life history a little bit. And you guys saw an example of that in lab. The infundibulum is just the stalk that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. So another thing the hypothalamus does, in addition to control things like seasonal timing, thirst, sex, appetitive behaviors, etc., I could go on and on, is regulate the activity of the pituitary gland. So it makes hormones that tell the pituitary gland what to do, and it produces chemicals involved in water balance, maintenance, and sexual behavior like antidiuretic hormone and like oxytocin. So the hypothalamus is kind of a big deal, has a lot of very important jobs, and it regulates a lot of very important functions. So here are a handful of them in addition to the ones that I just told you. So let's look at some more, shall we? Functions of the hypothalamus. It controls and integrates activities of the autonomic nervous system. So it can regulate smooth muscle tone. So I'm going to underline these and write tone, meaning that constant resting state of partial contraction, and regulates glands as well. I mentioned this part, so synthesizes regulatory hormones. These have names like gonadotropin releasing hormone, so GnRH, and this acts on the pituitary to cause the release of gonadotropins, which cause your gonads to make sex steroid hormones. So hypothalamus starts that chain off. Just one example, there are more. It contains cell bodies of axons that end in the posterior pituitary where they secrete hormones. So one of these is everybody's favorite hormone because it's a feel-good one, and that is oxytocin. So oxytocin gives us the pleasure of feeling feelings like love and friendship, as well as acting on smooth muscle to control processes like, for example, sexual climax and also labor and delivery of a baby. It also regulates rage, aggression, pain, pleasure, and arousal due to its connections with the limbic system. Feeding, thirst, and satiety centers are in here. So satiety is a feeling of satisfaction. So the general sort of qualitative feeling of, oh, I think I'm full, I don't have to eat anymore, or I am no longer thirsty, I have had enough water for now. So those are coordinated in the hypothalamus. It controls body temperature. So when you get a fever, that's your hypothalamus turning up the thermostat on your body to try and burn out whatever bad guy is in you. And as I mentioned, via the suprachiasmatic nucleus, input from the eyes and the pineal gland, it helps to regulate your daily patterns of sleep. So you may have noticed sleep has come up a lot so far. We talked about sleep in the context of the reticular activating system. We're talking about it again. So sleep rhythms, or how often you sleep, are coordinated by the hypothalamus, and we will actually talk about sleep in quite a bit of detail later in the PowerPoint, so stay tuned for more sleep info. It's really important. Oh, I forgot. Also, we talked about sleep when we talked about cerebrospinal fluid. So remember, you have to sleep, and if you don't, your CSF doesn't flush toxins and amyloid plaques from between your neurons, and that's why you will die if you don't get enough sleep. So hopefully by now you understand the importance of getting enough and regular sleep, and you're at least trying to do so. All right, so that puts us at about 46 minutes, which is the maximum that my computer can handle with regard to length of these videos. So I'm signing off at slide 45, and we will pick up where we left off, starting with the epithalamus next time. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you for the last chunk of this PowerPoint.